if the world decides that this war must be stopped finally and gives us everything we need, we will do it. We will conduct our counteroffensive. We will go to the Azov Sea. We will secure that area. We'll make sure that Russians cannot use the Kharkiv Bridge. They cannot use the land, their land bridge, land connection to Crimea. And basically losing Crimea will be an end for Putin. I'm sure, I'm convinced that it will happen. If not, this war will continue for years. Unfortunately, it will not end good, neither for Ukraine nor for our European allies and friends.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for TimesRadio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking once again about the latest on the war in Ukraine with regular Frontline guest, Operator Starsky, Ukrainian veteran, YouTuber and co-founder of the Propaganda Study Institute. Operator Starsky, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
I wanted to begin by just asking you about comments we've had recently from the French President Macron. He has suggested that NATO troops could actually be deployed to Ukraine if the situation doesn't improve on the front line. Now, in response, we've had from Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, a typically bullish response from Moscow, implying essentially that would escalate into some kind of third world war. But what do you make of what President Macron had to say?
It was really interesting to hear that from President Macron, considering that since 2022, leaders of the NATO countries did basically everything in order to evade bringing NATO troops to Ukraine. And of course, I think it's one of the first signs that probably the picture is changing nowadays, which is not really good for Russia. Because Russia apparently expected that the world would continue, this limited, providing this absolutely limited military support to Ukraine, and also considering that currently Russia is blocking all the initiatives within the UNSC. I think it's a good sign for us. People are afraid of the escalation, but people must understand that until Russia is ruled by this terrorist regime of Vladimir Putin, the escalation will continue regardless of NATO's decision, and it will continue until this regime is either destroyed or until democracies are destroyed in Europe and in the US.
Do you sense that in Europe now there is a renewed understanding of the need to increase both military aid to Ukraine, but also to get tough and to talk tough with Putin? I mean, let's just park for one moment what's happening with the US aid package in Congress. But in terms of what's happening in European countries, we've seen Denmark, for example, give over their entire artillery supply to Ukraine. Sweden, obviously, is now going to go ahead and join NATO after Hungary dropped its objections. Do you get the sense almost that Europe is once again focusing on this issue?
Yes, I absolutely have this sensation that Europe understands that if they lose one of their biggest allies, which is the US, one of the biggest allies in terms of military power and military support, they will have to face Putin alone. And not a single European country can do that. Not a single European country can withstand Russian aggression on its own. That's why I think they understand that they must not only increase the support for Ukraine, but also increase their own capabilities to defend from the Russian terrorism collectively.
And just on the issue of Sweden joining NATO, which we expect to probably happen formally in the next couple of days, how historic is that, given Sweden for decades through the Cold War, through the Second World War, was politically neutral and militarily neutral, to then have Sweden, following Finland, joining NATO? How significant is that?
It's a really important decision for Europe, I would say, for the collective security of Europe. And also, Sweden, of course, stayed neutral for quite a while, but from the history, we know that centuries ago, and Putin loves history, as, as we all know, in his own perverted way. Yeah, there were conflicts, and again, since Putin remembers Genghis Khan, then he also remembers those events as old as 300-400 years old. Yeah, it's a good decision. Again, we see that European countries understand the importance of joining the NATO, joining alliances, defensive alliances. We know the Russian reaction basically since 2022, when Sweden and Finland announced their intention to join NATO for the first time. And Zakharova and also the deputy of the Security Council of Russia, they said that first of all, it will turn. They said that in such a cunning way, like Russia will defend itself. That's why Sweden will turn into a military target for the Russian troops. This is such an interesting way to defend your country by preemptively invading and striking other countries. Only Russians can do that. So I'm applauding to Swedish decision, and we are hoping to see Ukraine also besides Sweden in the NATO someday.
You mentioned a moment ago Vladimir Putin's slightly perverted interpretation of European history. I just wanted to ask you about your current work, because since we spoke last, you've co-founded the Propaganda Study Institute. Just tell us a bit about it.
So this institute was founded by a group of Ukrainian journalists and psychologists and communication specialists. And we see our mission as defending democracy through combating the informational warfare conducted by the totalitarian regimes. So we're not only fighting against the misinformation that is shared and conducted by the Russian Terrorist Federation, but also China, Iran. They do a lot in this regard. They basically copy-paste Russian propaganda big time because Russian hybrid warfare proved to be really efficient, and from those processes that we see nowadays in Europe with the rising power of far-right movements across Europe and in the US, we see that this hybrid warfare brings good results for Russians, not for us, unfortunately. So we have to do everything we can to destroy Russian propaganda machine, which is a really hard task. But people were talking a lot about, importance, the necessity of creating some kind of institution that would combat the Russian misinformation, and nobody did that so far. So we decided to create this institute. And also, since we're Ukrainians and since we faced Russian propaganda not only since 2014 but decades before that, Russians started their massive misinformation against Ukraine in approximately 2008, around the invasion of Georgia. So we decided to share our experience, and of course we will cooperate with different organizations and journalists and international lawyers that also work in this field. So this is us.
Well, it sounds like brilliant work you're doing. I know it's early days. Just from a practical perspective, how will you push back against that misinformation?
First of all, we want to expose the pro-Russian movements and pro-Russian opinion makers that basically spread the terrorist narratives. in the Europe and in the US as well. And also we want to destroy the double standards that exist nowadays, because Russia was recognized as a terrorist state by the Parliamentary Assembly of the European Union in 2022 and by the NATO Assembly as well that very year. And at the same time, there are politicians, not only politicians, different opinion makers, bloggers, people who call themselves journalists, unfortunately, who think that they still have this right to spread misinformation and terrorist narratives. The problem with Russian hybrid warfare, and specifically informational warfare, is that the terrorist regime that absolutely doesn't care about democracy and that wants to destroy democracy spreads those narratives in European environment where people believe in things like freedom of speech, freedom of press, etc. At the same time, freedom of speech and freedom of press don't exist in Russia whatsoever. That's why we have to eliminate double standards, and that's why we have to shut down the terrorist narratives forever and protect democracy and freedom in Europe and in the US as well.
And do you see it primarily as being about protecting people in the West from Russian disinformation?
It's one of the things, because Russian disinformation is a combat weapon. Within the frames of the hybrid warfare, information is used as weapon for reaching the military goals and geopolitical goals of Russian Federation. That's why one of the goals is to develop some kind of legal solution of fighting the Russian misinformation.
I must ask you, whilst we're on this topic, what you made of the US journalist, if you want to call him that, Tucker Carlson's interview with Vladimir Putin recently. It was extraordinary. Hard to call it journalism, really, but what was your take on it?
Oh my God, I can talk a lot about it, actually, because, in the beginning, I was worried about it, because this is pure Russian propaganda that is just given to the society, to the democratic society, which is probably Putin's dream come true. But at the same time, specifically because it was Putin, not Lavrov, not Peskov, not Zakharova, not Solovyov, but specifically Putin, I was happy in the end, because the more he talked, the more, even his supporters in the US, in Europe, the more they realized that this man has to go. And he has to go to The Hague, at least. So it was hilarious. Of course, the sad thing about this interview is, while Tucker Carlson, who calls himself a journalist, was interviewing Putin, another American journalist, Ivan Gershkovich, was sitting there behind the bars in the Russian prison. Alexei Navalny was dying in a different Russian prison, while Tucker Carlson attempted to show that there is freedom of speech and democracy in Russia, and the cherry on a cake was, in my opinion, his trip to the local supermarket, where he admired the prices. At the same time, he basically paid for all those goods that he bought. He paid like monthly salary of the cashier working in that supermarket. It was insane, but I'm glad that Putin was the man who did this interview, because Putin, even though he's a cunning KGB spy, but at the same time, talking is not his strongest side, his strongest skill. It's not. Solovyov does that professionally, and basically he has a lot of people who do that professionally for him, but he's not a speaker. He's a decision maker, but he's not an opinion maker, in my opinion.
Let's come on to the situation on the front line where things are a little bit more difficult for Ukraine. Obviously, we've seen the Russians capturing Avdiivka. How much significance do you place on that?
It was a significant loss for us, big time, but at the same time, we follow the same strategy in Avdiivka that we followed in areas like Rubizhne, where my brigade was deployed, like Bakhmut, where again my brigade also was deployed. So when situation changes and we lose the strategic initiative, we have to do what we can, which basically inflict casualties to the enemy as much as possible, and slowly withdraw our troops, saving as many men as possible. And I think this operation of withdrawing troops went well, not perfectly, of course. Unfortunately, there were casualties and several men were captured. I know that men from 110th Brigade, they were captured and executed by the Russian terrorists, but we managed to save a lot of lives, luckily, and those guys will continue fighting. The problem that we faced in Avdiivka was related to lack of shells. Of course, we have quite a few drones operating in the area, but the problem with drones is that in such areas as Avdiivka, Bakhmut, not so much on the southern front, but the eastern front and northern front, talking about Kupiansk. Russians are using a lot of radio electronic warfare machines, the jammers that are able to jam our drones. And in this situation, nothing helps as much as 155 millimeter shells that we needed. Not only shells, missiles, long-range missiles, etc., but shells primarily. And we faced lack of such ammunition. And it was, I would say, one of the most crucial moments in this operation. We saw that cluster munitions are very efficient against the Russian terrorists. And in situation when we cannot use long-range artillery, but Russians can use their long-range artillery on us, rendering our counter-battery measures absolutely inefficient. We had to withdraw, unfortunately.
You mentioned a moment ago that you personally were deployed in that stretch of the front line. Just tell us what you saw there, what the fighting was like when you were serving.
So my brigade was deployed to Rubizhne. I wasn't there. I was operating in the area of Bakhmut and Chasiv Yar last year in August. And currently we know that Chasiv Yar is undergoing insane strikes on a daily basis by the Russian aviation and artillery. So back then, it was pretty much like today in terms of it wasn't like bravely fighting at the position, it was evading Russian artillery and drones, because even in order to get to the positions, you had to survive those several kilometers, because Russians were targeting all kinds of vehicles. There were cases when Russians would use their 152 millimeter artillery to target single soldiers going to to their positions. So it was like that. It was pretty hard. But back then in August, we had a lot of artillery on our side. It was on parity. I would say that we had advantage in terms of the range and precision, of course. And we could effectively eliminate Russian artillery equipment, their howitzers. We had quite a few missiles for HIMARS. HIMARS was operating, let's say, somewhere in the area. again, very efficiently. But currently, situation is completely different. Unfortunately, we didn't receive those shells that we were promised throughout the months, throughout the years, basically. And this is the end result that we see. We can fight, we do it efficiently, but we cannot fight without weapons.
And we've heard stories of soldiers now on the front line having to husband their resources, having to ration ammunition, essentially. What is morale like on the front line at the moment? Obviously, that's been a strength of Ukraine in the war so far, but what's it like at the moment?
Morale is strong because the strongest motivator for the Ukrainian soldiers remain their families behind our backs, and we have nowhere to retreat because there are our families. This is the morale. Russians have to be convinced to go to Ukraine because Russians have zero reason to be here and to die here for Putin's ambitions. That's why Russians use their incredibly strong and powerful propaganda. But Ukrainians don't need propaganda. We have our families, and that's the only reason we're fighting for.
How prepared do you think Ukraine is for a likely Russian offensive in the late spring? President Zelensky said very recently he's expecting a new Russian offensive to begin maybe in May. How prepared, given the lack of Western military aid from the US in particular at the moment, how prepared do you think Ukraine is to deal with that?
Well, I would say we will see a lot of dynamic fighting because I expect that the shells will be delivered to Ukraine. There will be withdrawals. There will be offenses. The situation will be pretty much dynamic. But in case those shells are not delivered to Ukraine, then we will see, as I said, Ukrainian army delivering casualties to the Russian invaders and slowly withdrawing, trying to inflict as many casualties as possible and save as much personnel as possible.
Do you see any prospect in 2024 of a Ukrainian counteroffensive?
It is of course possible, and again, everything depends on the weaponry. So, if the world decides that this war must be stopped finally, and gives us everything we need, we will do it. We will conduct our counteroffensive. We will go to the Azov Sea. We will secure that area. We will make sure that Russians cannot use the Kharkiv Bridge. They cannot use the land, their land bridge, land connection to Crimea. And basically losing Crimea will be an end for Putin. I'm sure, I'm convinced that it will happen. If not, this war will continue for years. Unfortunately, it will not end good, neither for Ukraine nor for our European allies and friends.
Just on the Kerch Bridge, do you think that it might be targeted by these longer range ATACMS missiles that reportedly the White House is keen to give Ukraine if this aid package does pass the Senate in America? Do you think if Ukraine had those, and of course you've had ATACMS but not the longer range ones, they would be used against the Kerch Bridge?
It is possible, but from my experience, I can tell this. Missiles are not really good against bridges because even though Russian Kerch Bridge is not a good bridge, okay, but at the same time, people build bridges for thousands of years, and I personally saw several bridges that were targeted by Russian missiles, like Tochka U, for example, and they withstood those strikes. So we need something either more precise, I would say, or more powerful, like Tomahawk missiles. Those could do the job. Not sure about the ATACMS, but generally missiles smaller than Tomahawk, they cannot damage bridges well, let's say.
And I suppose fundamentally as well, what would really help destroy the Kerch Bridge is if you had the air power, the air support that the Ukraine's been crying out for since the start of the war.
Yeah, absolutely. If we had enough attack aircraft, but not only attack aircraft, of course, they have to be supported by interceptors, then we could deliver this damage to the Kerch Bridge and cut it from the military supplies, because this 50% of this bridge, which is the rail part of this bridge, is only used to deliver Russian troops, Russian tanks, artillery, and shells to the Russian troops located on the Crimean Peninsula.
I mean, the Kerch Bridge is not only strategically so important, it is symbolically so important because of its history. And given Putin loves a victory that he can sell to his people, I mean, even the capture of Avdiivka, he's using in a propaganda sense ahead of the Russian elections. Were the Kerch Bridge to be destroyed, how significant a symbolic blow would that be to Putin?
That would be incredible strike on his image and reputation. That's 100%. And we all know that Putin loves that bridge big time. He drove his yellow, what he had, like Lada or something, down that bridge. Yeah, of course it will be a big hit, but it will be even more than that. It will be a big strategic advantage for the Ukrainian defenders.
Just a couple of questions to finish up. We started this conversation by talking about NATO and the prospect of NATO troops actually fighting in Ukraine, and we've touched on Sweden joining NATO this week as well. How confident are you feeling now, Operator Starsky, about Ukraine joining NATO?
Not really. Not really, because a lot of people don't know this. A lot of people who support Putin's terrorism convinced that the invasion of Ukraine happened because of NATO expansion. Ukraine was rejected from becoming a NATO member for years. In 2021, in 2020, in 2019, and people must understand that. Before the invasion, the number of people supporting joining NATO in Ukraine was something around 40%. That's another thing that people don't know, but the information is out there. So I'm a bit skeptic about that. But I hope that I'm wrong.
And just finally, how much work will you be doing with the Propaganda Study Institute around the Russian presidential election next month?
We'll be working on that, but our main target is, of course, pro-Russian forces operating freely in Europe, in the European countries, and in the US. Russian presidential elections, they are mostly Russian internal business, and they are all the propaganda that will be involved will be directed mainly at Russian internal audience, not so much on the external audience. So I think we'll be working mainly with the pro-Russian movements inside Europe.
Operator Starsky, always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to the Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.